All right, good morning, everyone. Or good morning, I should say, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depends on where you are in the world today on this December 9th, 2020. It's great to have you here. My name is Dr. Cameron Norman, and I am the president of Cense Limited and the principal of the Cense Academy, training program and platform for innovators. This is the third in a series of webinars looking at the art and science of change. And today, our focus is on something called the systems of influence. It's titled The Hidden Forces That Shape Innovation. So we're going to be looking at the idea of systems thinking today and going through a lot about what that means and what it might mean for you as an innovator as we move along. So it's exciting. It's interesting stuff. It's exciting for me. It's great to have you here. And let's, with no shortage of things to talk about, let's get going. First of all, I just want to set up just a few sort of housekeeping notes. First of all, this is being recorded. So you as a registered attendee will get a newsletter. You will get a link with the recording to that. You'll also get access to the slides as well as some additional resources. So you don't need to worry if something happens and you weren't able to make it, or you are joining and you can only join for part of it, you will get some of those resources. Secondly, this is being recorded, as I mentioned, technical issues being what they are. If you're having issues with sound, if you're having issues with other things, what I would suggest you do is probably to log back out and then log back in. Unfortunately, it's just me here. I don't have a full technical team, so I'm not able to respond to things in real time. So if you're having some difficulty, that would be my recommendation as to how to proceed with that. And then lastly, the way this is going to work is I will talk a little bit as we go. There will be a couple of opportunities for some exchanges as we go along, and then there will be a chance for us to have some conversation at the end of this. So you'll have a chance to take notes and sit back and relax and hopefully become a systems thinker. So with that, let's get going and let's see what we can do here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to talk about systems right here. All right. So let's start out. Systems of influence. Again, this is where we are today. This is how things are working. Let's go to the next slide. So systems and innovation. So today, this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about what exactly are systems, and then why on earth should you care about those things if you're interested in innovation. We'll talk a little bit about the idea of perspective taking and what that means for those operating in these kinds of conditions. We're also going to take a look at different types of organization and organization of systems, not necessarily organizations in themselves. We're also going to talk about acting in systems and the implications for innovation. So we're going to be going through all of those things together at once. So just as a bit of a background, I am a professor of behavioral science. I do professional practice as an organizational consultant and coach. I've done a lot of consulting. I've conducted research and postdoctoral training in systems thinking. So I have a fair bit of idea about how to do systems and systems thinking. But that's really where I got my ability to understand systems. Part of that has to do with the work that I do around understanding innovation and how to do innovation in practice. So with that, I also work with this new venture called the Cense Academy. We'll talk a little bit about that relatively soon. So we'll get a chance to be able to chat a bit more about that coming up. So stay with us. Okay, so the question being, what exactly is innovation? This is where our starting point is. We've talked about this in the last two webinars, and we'll be continuing to talk a little bit about this. So definition of systems of innovation for us is learning transformed into value by design. Now that's a definition that I use. We use it at Cense. You might not find that necessarily out in the academic community, but it is what we use. And the reason for that largely is because when you think about innovation, it is about doing something new, but doing something new comes from learning. It comes from understanding, seeing things, seeing opportunities, and then being able to build from that and turn that into value. Now, learning may be observation, it may be through experimentation, it may be a lot of different things. But if you're not learning, so if it's not being absorbed and you're not transforming into value, it's not innovation. At least that's how we see it. So with that, I mean, we hope that you will find this resonates with you, but you may have a different definition. There's a lot of them out there. So when we talk about systems, what we're talking about is the organization of relationships, structures, and rules. And these could be human, they can be technological, they can be environmental, but they're the things that shape the context in which this learning, this innovation takes place. So that's really how that all comes together and why systems and systems thinking matter. So one of the things that we often think about is systems can be something that are relatively opaque, they can be a little obscure, they can be something that there's a lot of conversation around systems. Systems, from my experience as a professional, as an educator, is that systems are one of those things that people get really excited about. They also get really lost at. So hopefully what we're going to do today is cover some material that's going to allow us to talk at least a little bit about systems in a real practical way so that you can use that as an entrepreneur or an innovator. There. So this is part of a series of different steps. Our last session, we talked about this idea of psychology, the psychology of innovation. In a few weeks, we're going to talk about evaluation. This is the third kind of point on what we call frames of inquiry. So these are these ideas about how we frame and understand the context in which innovation takes place. So it's pretty important, but it's really part of a tripartite system where you understand how people behave and think and perceive, which is psychology, how we evaluate things, how we understand what it is that we're doing, evaluation. The third thing, which is what we're talking about today, is systems. Those are those somewhat governing structures. So when we talk about a system, we are talking a group of interdependent or independent, but interrelated elements that comprise a unified whole. These are a couple of other definitions of what we're looking for. Now, really, when we talk about a system, it's a set of things that are interconnected that have some type of logic or coherence. So that's really what we're talking about. It doesn't have to be very fancy. It doesn't have to be very technological. It doesn't have to be anything that is really technical. But what it is something that brings things together. They can be human, they can be technological, they can be environmental, or they can be some type of an interplay between all of those things together. So that's something to think about, is that systems that occur all over the place, they exist in nature. We create systems and we interact with systems all the time. But most of the time, they're quite invisible to us. And what we do in systems thinking and innovation is try to make those things visible to people. So that's really where systems thinking comes in. It sounds like it might be quite academic, but actually it's something that really can work quite well for innovators, whether you're an entrepreneur, you're running a restaurant, whether you're running a healthcare center, or whether you're trying to develop something new and technical or a new technology or something like that. Systems thinking can work for all of those things. So here are some systems considerations to think about. Number one is systems are governed mostly by the idea of coherence. That's what makes a system. If it's just a bunch of things together and there's no coherence that draw them together, that really isn't what a system is. As humans, what we're looking for is meaningful coherence. So we're trying to understand how things might come together. So if we think about an organization, one of the exercises that I often will do when teaching students is often ask them, tell me a little bit about what is the system of the organization that you're talking to. Now, what's interesting is if you're, say, teaching students in a university, for example, they may choose who is a part of the their class. So what they might say is those people who are registered and enrolled. Okay. Now, would they include people like the instructor? Well, they might say, okay, yeah, that's he or she is part of the system. Would you include the other faculty and say other departments that might not necessarily be teaching that particular class? Some might say yes or no. Would you include staff? Would you include administration? Would you include alumni? Would you include the facilities staff that are a part of this? Every one of those answers can produce a reasonable set of answers to say, yes, that's true. Our university, for example, might include all of those people. We may also think, no, what we're thinking about when we think about university, we're thinking about our class. We're thinking about our things. They're bounded by our choices in terms of how we do that. So there isn't a good system or bad system, a right system or a wrong system. What there is choices around how we choose to bound systems. And how we make those choices make a big difference to whether or not we are, to exactly how we understand what we do for it. So coherence is also created by three things, as you can see. One is position. So where you sit in the system, and we'll talk about this in a minute, determines what it is that you see, what you prioritize, and how you act. Relationships. System is a connection between things. So it's us as humans relating to other things. It may be technological things, technical things, environmental things. Lastly, it's movement. Systems are not static. At least for the purposes of innovation, we're trying to understand what happens within them. Whether it is the flow of electricity through electrical systems, whether it is humans going from one organization to another, one unit to another, an idea going from one place to another. There's always some type of movement. Otherwise, it's not really of interest to us, at least as it comes to innovation. These all exist within boundaries and purposes, and sometimes they're nested within each other. And we're going to go through this as part of our talk today. So stay tuned. First of all, let's start out with boundaries. Boundaries are probably one of the biggest things. As I mentioned, is how we choose to bound things really matter. If you take a look at the image in front of you, you might decide, well, what part is the farm? So the farm could be bounded by a fence, as you see there. It could be the legally entitled area that you measure. It may be the farm, from the farmer's perspective, might be, well, I want to look at the entire ecosystem. While I may not own all the property, what I grow and how I grow it is affected entirely by the landscapes around this. So from the farmer's perspective, their farm might be this entire valley. Not from a legal standpoint, but maybe bounding it in terms of what happens in that valley determines what happens on that farm. So from them, they might be bounding it. If you're a farm worker, you might be assigned to work in a particular part of the field. That may be the only thing that you care about. The point is that how we bound things really matters, and matters a lot. And as innovators, what we need to do is figure out what are the boundaries that are most useful for what we're intending to do. So think about that in terms of why boundaries matter. So if you're running a restaurant, does it matter what's happening down the street? It might, if what's happening down the street is dependent on what you do or how you do it, for example. So your competitors might actually matter in terms of promoting business, taking away business, influencing business. So if you're selling something that is very similar to your competitor and your competitor does a terrible job of that, it might be an advantage for you. Likewise, you might need to keep up with them. Or you might be able to buy together. So you might be able to work together. How you bound that system really makes a huge difference to what happens next. So what are the implications for innovation? So I've covered some of these things. So first of all, who is part of your market and who is part of your competitive set? This can be determined by understanding boundaries. What is their experience surrounding your product? So what do people understand your product in and of itself, or is it something that they take away with that? Is this, for example, if you go to a Disney park, a Disney theme park, for example, one of the things that they predicate their value proposition based on is lifetime memories. So the idea isn't that you just have a good day at the park, is that you go back to your home, you have photos, you have images, you have stuffed toys or souvenirs, you think about it for the rest of your life. That's how at least they want to position things. Is that something you want, or is this something that you're looking at only in a moment? So that's something to consider. What are the needs of people who are in relation to there? So what kind of relationships do they have? Which ones do you need to consider? And who sets the boundaries? As I mentioned with the farm example earlier, is it the farmer? Is it the revenue, your tax collector? Is it the surveying office, the local city? Those are the kinds of things that you need to think. Is it about environmentalists? Those are things you need to think about. And they're all negotiated. Again, these things are not good or bad, but how you make those choices and who makes those choices determine how you can understand systems. Next piece is around perspective taking. This is really important. This is a big thing. So as I mentioned earlier, the idea of what a system looks like depends on where you sit within it. These pictures, for example, are all from the exact same building, but obviously things look quite different. Some are close up, some are further away, some are up top, some are down below. As you can imagine, this structure has some coherence to it architecturally, but what you also notice is that it looks very different. This is the Bund in Berlin, the seat of the German government. This particular building was designed explicitly for this kind of a thing. You can walk around it and you see so many different things. Plus the fact is that it has mirrors, provides you with a different look and a different feel. So systems look different from where you sit within them. So that's really quite key. So understanding what those perspectives might mean really depends, makes a big difference in terms of understanding how you understand your system. It all sounds fairly simple, doesn't it? But where this becomes really important might be, for example, is if you're thinking about, say, your customers. Your customers are coming into, say, your store, for example, or your shop. They will see the relationship that you have to those products, and those products differently depending on where they come in. What they see is this just another shop, or is this a very special, unique place? They might treat things quite differently based on that. But how things are connected is actually really quite critical. So one of the tools that we use in systems thinking is this idea about map making and visual systems. So we really want to make things visual because the human cortex, our brains, are not able to take in all of this information all at once. So if I was to tell you a story about a system and describe all of the details, I could do that. I could easily describe, if we come back to our example of the farm, I could describe all of those qualities. I could describe elevation, I could moisture, crops grown, wind speed, number of staff on site, animals and plants, et cetera, et cetera. It would be a lot for you to take in. Or I could draw a map. I could show where relationships are. I could describe them, but what would happen is if I actually brought them together and I actually showed a visual of that. So you can actually see positions here and there. Map making is something that we do in systems all the time. It's really one of the most important things that we do. Now the maps might not necessarily be cartography kind of things. What they might be is just simply trying to understand positioning, location, relative things. We can do that through simple diagrams. We can do things through data-driven processes. We can actually make literally physical maps. We can do a lot of different things. I'll show you some examples of this as we get into things, and you'll have a chance to be able to see a little bit about what it means to be able to create a great system map. So one of the techniques that's doing this much more from a social standpoint is something called a day in the life. And it is a technique that is basically walking people through what their day looks like, because what that starts to do is reveal what a system looks like. So let's illustrate just so you get a sense. So probably many of you are sitting at home right now watching this You might have children, you might have partners, you may have lots of different people all coming together to try and access this particular this webinar. You might be doing multiple things simultaneously. You might be coming at this later on. You might be watching the video at home or somewhere else. But the fact is, right now, if you think about it, a lot of people are learning online, and they're often doing it at their home. So when you design an experience, this particular experience, just to give you a sense, was being designed for somewhat everybody. So which means that it doesn't have any specific design qualities that are meant for people who are at home versus whether you're at the office, whether it's live or whether it is recorded. So that is intentional. If this was meant to be a live seminar where it's a one-time only, we'd have much more interaction. We'd have much more people. In my opinion, that's the better way to do things. If I was recording it only for remote, I wouldn't give you the opportunity to ask some questions because that really doesn't offer much. I might have you just comment things in the chat box below, something like that. So what we're doing right now is we're designing things. The innovations might be, in this case, educational content, and an educational experience. But the reason I mention this is because it also depends on where you are. So if I'm presenting this to be time agnostic, it's one thing. However, what we're finding is right now with a lot of students is we still schedule classes at a particular time and they log in. And then there's a lot of benefits to doing that. But one of the things we think about is what is the purpose? So if we think about a system, what is the purpose of all of this to do? And educators may say to educate students, to teach them skills and knowledge and inspire them and train them for future careers, and maybe all of those kinds of things. So if that's true, we can unpack some of the assumptions behind what that means. So what that means might be is that you need to keep people engaged. You need to give people good content, and you need to do it in a way that holds their attention. So those are all three assumptions. So we have a couple of people sitting in front of us. They're on online learning right now. What preparations do they have for their day? Well, they may be sitting there on this couch all the time. They may have nowhere to go because of the pandemic right now. They may be sitting at home. They may be sheltering in place. They may have been on their computer all day. They may be so exhausted from the computer that even if the content is really interesting, they may not be necessarily ready to learn. Or they may be looking at the computer going, thank God, there's something different than just watching television or Netflix or something like that. So a day in the life, if we come back to that method, might be, how did they start out today? Did they get a good night's sleep? Did they get any sleep? Where did they sleep? Are they at home? Are they tired? Are they with their partner and they're finally stressed out? So one person's sleeping on the couch because they're not getting along well. So are they rested at all? Are they ready to do this? Is the learning experience anything different than what they had before? What's going to happen afterwards? These are the kinds of things that you might do. And what you can do is you can track people. So the method might be is you interview people and say, well, tell me a little bit about what happened. So you came to Dr. Norman's webinar on systems thinking. What happened right before you came onto the webinar? Well, I was checking email. Okay. What happened right before that? Well, I was still checking email because I had a lot of it to do. And what were you doing before that? Well, I was making a snack and I was going back. So you might walk all the way back to when they woke up. And then you start to find out the context of which somebody came into this experience. Now, you can also do the other side. Is that, so what happened afterwards? So if I'm trying to give you content to help inspire you and maybe think critically about systems, what you might find is that what happens afterwards really matters. You might have this moment of just to sit and focus. But then the moment you put the laptop down, you've got kids to deal with, you've got other people to deal with, you've got all this stuff like this. You might not have a chance to integrate the notes that you take and the recording. You might be able to visit the recording again. So that may affect what happens afterwards. All of these things are to say that it's not to say that the innovation, which might be educational in this case, can control all of that. But what it does mean is that we need to account for that, because those are things that we might be able to adjust for, modify for, or meet the needs for in terms of understanding systems and systems innovation. So let's talk a little bit right now about organizing. So this is a big thing. So how systems are organized matters a lot because it matters on how we tackle big problems. So that's really where we're going to go in next, is taking a look at organizing themes and strategies for understanding and making sense of systems, because there's a lot of different types out there. We can start to show you what some of these things mean. So this is an image. This is from Dave Snowdon. It's an image he created and his team at Cognitive Edge, and it's something called the Cynefin Framework, and I'll spell that on the next slide. It's a Welsh term, so you'll be able to see what that means. What this was designed to help understand and make sense of organization of systems. So as we mentioned, systems are about coherence. And how coherence is created, how it's sustained, and how it evolves within the dynamics of a particular system, because things are moving, really helps us to understand how we might approach particular problems or issues. So this is a branch often called complexity science. And I will tell you that one of the things is, while I have studied systems for many years, and I've taught it at graduate schools, one of the things that I find very troublesome around the systems and systems thinking literature and scholarship is that a lot of use of really sophisticated language and terms and turf and all of those kinds of things, of which there are in many different areas of life. But I find that systems thinking tends to be very opaque to a lot of people and inaccessible, which is unfortunate. Some people view systems thinking as a separate thing from complexity, science, and other things. I'm not going to talk about the distinctions that much today, but what I will do is focus on the idea of understanding systems organizations, and that's through the Cynefin framework. Just, I say this largely in case when you want to go and do some research on your own, you may find that there's some distinctions between how these terms are used. So as I mentioned, Dave Snowdon, he's the principal of Cognitive Edge, is a consultancy that's done a lot of work. He does a lot of training. He's probably done more to advance this kind of work than almost anybody, but he's now actually been able to develop this idea of the framework with a lot of other scholars around the world. So it's really quite a global movement. And there's a recent book that's just come out profiling some of this. But what it is you notice from this framework is that there's 4 different categories. So you see, if you look at the bottom right corner, which I believe is, you would say, is a simple systems. These are the domain of best practice. We use that term a lot, and we'll come back to that in a moment. If we go above that, we go complicated systems. Then we go beside that, we've got complex systems, and then we've got chaotic systems. So all of these systems, these are different types of systems. And we're going to go into some of these things, but let's take a look at what these things might mean. So for example, say you are looking at developing a workshop, for example. And this is an example that I've borrowed for this. So if we look at the top left-hand corner visually, it's collaboration. So you're trying to address something like climate change, and you're thinking that one of the things we can do is take some data from commuters and understand what kind of traffic patterns, what kind of pollutants as a result of that are. That is a complex task, and it's complex because there's no best practice for how to do that. You might collaborate with people. You may need to decide who's going to be at the table. What are they going to offer? You might not necessarily know what they're going to say. They're going to bring ideas together, and you don't necessarily know what the product is going to be. But you come together and you might actually develop a survey. Now that's kind of complicated. Again, we're going to get into this in just a minute. So it's complicated in terms of there's lots of different sequences and steps, but you can start to get a little bit of a sense as to what how these things might be organized together. These go down to the idea of dissemination. That's a really simple task. Simple tasks are the kind of things that are very straightforward. You can predict, you can reasonably control, you can have a very clear expectation of something. These might go back towards facilitation, and as you can see, there's a number of different ways to do this. One of the ways that Dave Snowdon articulates this in quite a humorous way is using the example of a party. Now, if you think about a good party, one of the things that makes a good party is you don't always know what's going to happen. But we do know some principles that we can use to help facilitate a reasonably good event. So we know that there may be, you want to have probably a certain mix of people. You probably don't want to have people at the party that strongly dislike each other. So you probably want to get people that have some common interests, but you also want to make sure there's a little bit of differences. So people who are maybe a little bit more talkative, people who might not be so talkative, people from different backgrounds and stuff. So there's something to talk about. As a host, you may also realize that another principle might be you need to have food. Don't necessarily need to know what food it is, but you do need to know a little bit about your guests and think a little bit about, well, is anybody vegetarian or vegan, or do people like a particular type of cuisine? How might we be able to incorporate those things together to create food? So there's no real recipe for it, but there's some general principles. Maybe some music, maybe you need some things around space. There's things that you can consider. That's what makes it complex, is the ability to not be able to predict time and again what that is. That's a real important organizing principle for systems. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. But really one of the things I want to emphasize here is that the idea that this is a set of activities that require different levels of expectation, different types of action, and different ways of assessment. So understanding what comes from that. So think about your expectations, your actions, and your assessment. So let's talk about simple systems. As we see here in the top corner, let me just move myself down. So the simple system there is clear, stable, observable relationships between things. So I have a mug here. If you want to get water into this mug, the best way to do it is to pour it right in the top. We might be able to have some material science that might allow us to do this by osmosis. We might be able to do all kinds of different things, but just generally putting it in the top works pretty much every time. That is a simple system. So we see simplicity all over the place. So these are things where we talk about best practice, which is a term that is used a lot and misused often. So best practice means that we can weigh all the different alternatives of how to get water into that mug, for example, and we can say this is the best one. This clearly delivers greater value consistently over time. And we can predict it, we can probably control it, we can create guidelines and protocols. Great. So evidence is based, so you have a real strong evidence base for that. You can reliably expect something, and you can understand what the outcomes might be and what kind of products. We think about those things in life that you can expect consistently. These are things where there's not a lot of, it's not very complicated. Almost anybody can come to understand them. They're around us all the time. So that's a simple system. Now, complicated systems have a little bit more organization to them. So, for example, one of the things we might think about is that mechanical things are great examples of this. So you might have your computer. One of the things that's often used in this area is the idea of like a rocket to the moon. There may be a lot of different parts to that, but we have a science and we have background, and you can bring in expertise to help understand how to do that. Now, most of the cases, these relationships are relatively straightforward, but if we take something mechanical, let's say like an automobile, you might have a problem with your automobile, and you may take it into hopefully an honest mechanic. That mechanic you can take 4 out of 5 mechanics might suggest the same thing for how to repair it. The 5th mechanic may suggest something different. It still may work, but it just might be something different. So it's not that it's consistently the same, like a simple system. What it means is there may be some variation, but generally speaking, if you're an expert, you know how to do that. When we talked about the cup and water coming into that, you don't need to be an expert to that. You can simply see that and replicate that consistently. You can do the same thing over and over again. You don't need a lot of expertise in this. In this case, you have a lot of different parts together, and they're organized in a particular way where expertise really comes in quite helpful. The other thing is understanding past practice. So what makes a good mechanic is somebody who's seen a lot of different cars, maybe a lot of different makes and models. So if you've got a problem, you've got a funny noise or something like that, they can diagnose the problem because they're relying on past practice to be able to understand future activities or current activities. So that's really what that's all about. So, and you can take a bunch of different data. You might not necessarily know what it's doing right away, but you can analyze that and come up with some conclusions. So these are kind of the key words to think about. Now, you can think about your own certain circumstances and imagine where are these situations most prevalent or more likely. So these are things that you can start to take a look at and make some decisions based on that. Chaotic systems also exist in nature, just like all of these other systems. However, one of the things that it's important to note is the fact is that these tend to be very short, quick, very intense kind of things. We often use the term chaos, but really we often don't necessarily mean it's always chaotic. A chaotic system doesn't have, has no visible order. There may be some order to it, but we can't really detect what that means. So in this case, when things are chaotic, there's a lot of different movement going on. So we talk about, these, we're not sure where the boundaries are of the system. We have a lot of things going on. We don't know, we can't create any, we're not sure what the coherence is in this. We don't understand the relationships between things. We're just trying to figure things out. And we've experienced some of that in 2020, these moments of chaos where we're not sure what's going on. But in those cases, what the key is there is to simply create coherence out of the incoherent system. By that, it means acting first. That goes against often what we feel like, this idea like we want to think about and analyze in a chaotic moment. The idea is you act. Because what's interesting about acting is that it pushes you into a situation where you start to create coherence. Your movement in the system, your actions start to create something. So, for example, the start of the pandemic, things started to get locked down. Restaurants, for example, tried all kinds of different things. So they were sitting there thinking, how are they going to keep themselves open? Well, what we saw was a lot of massive experimentation very quickly. So restaurants were becoming liquor stores. They're becoming food shops. They were doing all kinds of different types of delivery within the bounds and the conditions that were available in a space that was changing very quickly, a policy landscape that was changing incredibly quickly. So what you do is you act, then you sense, but what's going on? You start to find coherence, and then you respond. And you keep doing that to eventually create some type of coherence. These states don't last long. They may rearrange things a lot though. So what often happens at the end of this can be quite unsettling as things resettle. So being prepared for that. We see these things with people shooting into a crowd. You see things with natural disasters. Most of the time, chaos is not something we welcome. It's brief, but it ends. And then things start to settle into something like it might be more complicated or simple, maybe, or even complex. So complex systems, I leave this for the last because this is, if we're working with humans, we're working with complexity. Now, complexity is something quite different. So this is very common. This is an incredibly common context. What it means in this case is that there's a lot going on and we can partly observe it, but we can't necessarily see the cause and effect. So what it might mean is if we come back to the example of a party, so for example, one of the things you might be able to do is say, well, I've got a lot of different food. So if you have, say, for example, let's just say, for example, you choose one type of food, cheeseburgers. I'm just going to pick something at random. You might decide to serve cheeseburgers. Well, what you might find is that all of a sudden that has a real problem, because when you load things up in terms of a single thing, you might find, oh, geez, some people are gluten-free, can't eat gluten, so your buns might not work. Some people are vegetarian or vegan, they don't eat meat. Some people are allergic to or sensitive to cheese. You might have all of these different things. Now, some people might like it just fine, but all of a sudden you've got a lot of complications. So what that does is it starts to tell you that maybe that isn't going to work. Another option might be, say you have cheeseburgers, but you have a number of other things. So you start to modulate things. You might say, well, you know what? If we replace the bun with a gluten-free bun, some people might be able to eat it. Or we might be able to say, we've got these burgers, but we've also got some other things. We've got some kebabs, we've got some veggies, and we've got a whole bunch of different things that we can offer there, just to use a kind of a common example. So the idea behind there is that you're getting feedback. Now, obviously, if you only have one thing to serve, you don't have any backup. But in a complex system, the idea is that diversity is really important. Because coming back to what we said earlier is where you sit in the system depends on what you see. So when you're a guest at a party, you're seeing the system that is the party differently than if you're the host. Then if you're somebody who's been to, it's like, this person has the same party every holiday party, every year, they do the same thing over and over again. They know what it's like. Maybe those are things that are very comfortable with them, so they're happy with it. Someone else might be, this is amazing. I've never seen this sort of thing before. These are the kinds of things that make something complex. What we're trying to do there is constantly calibrate alignment. So what we might find, to come back again to that party example, is the music that you might play at the beginning of the party might be kind of casual. So as people starting to arrive, they're starting to meet each other, kind of get things going. Well, what you might find then is that things start to, if the mood kind of goes down, elevate the music a little bit. So play something a little bit faster, something a little louder, something like that. And then you might find you play something else towards the end. Or if you're the host and you want your guests to leave, you might want to start playing the music that people don't like, as opposed to that. Or as they often do in pubs and restaurants, just shut the music off. That's calibration. So what you're doing is you're making some changes on the fly to the rules and the way things are being done to make decisions. That's complexity. There's a lot more to this, but it gives you a sense of, when you go through these kinds of things, to think about, what kind of system am I dealing with? Not to belabor the point, but I want to just add one more piece here. And this is this idea. This is called the Stacey Matrix. It's Ralph Stacey. He's one of the scholars who came up with this thing. Another way to think about this is that, where do you have lots of agreement? So there's a lot, we kind of know what's going on. We understand the causes, we know the consequences, and also the certainty. How, not just as there's a lot of agreement, but we actually are fairly certain in those things. The further that you go out, as you can start to see on that thing, you get simple systems, complicated systems, and chaotic. So chaotic systems are ones where you have very little agreement on what's happening, what are the core ingredients, what they're producing, and the certainty in terms of when you observe things, how it's linked to cause and effect. So that's just another way to be able to do that. So coming back, what does this mean for innovation? This is a lot of stuff, complexity, but really what it does, it comes down to this idea about constantly understanding your situation. Are you providing this idea of your staff, your colleagues, with this idea of best practices? When it's not, it's a complex system. Best practices don't work. I see this all the time. I work in healthcare. People use the term best practices when really they mean something else. And this isn't just wordsmithing. I want to make sure that that's absolutely clear, because when you think something is the best, you're going to adhere to that, because why would you do anything that's inferior? The problem is that if best actually isn't best, or it needs to be modified, you're going to make errors. And that's really where we see a lot of problems. So this isn't just about being academic or thinking about this idea that it's just about some technical words. No, this actually matters a lot. Another way to do this is make your system visible. So the more you can map out things, you can use things like the Cynefin Framework to plot things. You can use the Stacey Matrix, or you can just simply visualize things out on a map to show relations between different things. So it gives you a bit of a sense as to where things are. So if you own a shop, where are the shops around you? Where are the other shops around you? Literally, getting Google Maps can be really useful. My good friend James Donison does this with real estate photography. One of the things he does is he uses drones. He uses drones, takes drone photography of a property to show where things are in proximity to one another. Now, when you come to see a property in real estate, you're seeing all that anyways, but all of a sudden you get a picture of this, you're like, oh yeah, this is how close I actually might be to a shopping mall, to a park, to something else nearby. It's another way of framing things, making things visual that other real estate centers may not necessarily use. So that's really about this idea about new perspectives. So getting different perspectives helps. It's the same system, but when you see things differently, it changes the way you think about what it is that you're looking at. And then the other key thing is to experiment and evaluate consistently. Okay, so this is something, the iceberg. Now, we've often probably heard about the idea that, the iceberg is most of what is an iceberg, up to, I think it's 80% of an iceberg is below the surface of the water. This can be also another great metaphor for why systems and innovation matter. So understanding what the thing is, we often tend to do this. It's human nature. It is something that we are wired to do, is to focus on what is in front of us. The event may be the thing that's right in front of us. It may be the saber-toothed tiger that's about to kill us. It may be the marauders that are going to come and loot my village. Those are the things that we see. But those things are based on generally a pattern. In most cases, not always. So what systems thinking does is it gets us to think about, what is the event? What are the patterns and trends underneath that? And what are those patterns and things based on? Are there some structures for how those things are laid out? And then what are the mental models? So if we think about things like, this was a big year for elections worldwide, in particularly one particular country, as we all know. That was based on a mental model of how governance and government should work. If you think about the United States, for example, we think about this idea of democracy, and in the United States, it's a particular type of democracy. Most democracies are different, but they have an idea of what it means to have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and other branches of government. So what they does is they've created a set of structures around how those things are formed. So those things are often bound by legal agreements, by proclamations, by laws, those sorts of things. Those tend to generate patterns, and the patterns are the things where people know how the structures are, and people try to manipulate them in ways that gain advantage or allow them to do certain things. So we might be able to get a legislation passed if we do these kinds of things. These are patterns that we can work with within the structures, within this idea of what democracy is. And then there's the actual specific events. It may be a bill gets passed, people have a debate, those sorts of things. People get outraged at the bill or the debate. What it is based on a set of mental models. So what does this actually mean for an innovator? That's nice for democracy. What does it mean for me as an innovator? So one of the things we might do, this is where systems thinking and leadership start to come in. So what we know from the literature on leadership is great leaders provide a vision. They provide a vision for what can be. If we think about Martin Luther King, I have a dream. He didn't say, I have a plan, I have a strategy, I have a 3-point bullet point initiative to be able to do something. No, he had a dream. That was fairly vague, but it was around something that was a vision that people could go, yes, that's something I can work on. Mental models were what the civil rights movement started to think a little bit about. How can we reframe what it means to be human, what it means to be Black, what it means to be a citizen of the United States, and of course in other countries, because it spread internationally. So you start to think that way. Then you start to tackle things like the structures and patterns and events. So as an innovator, what you might want to do is, if you're with an organization, is, do you have a vision where people are moving towards? Then how do you start to codify some of those things, creating some flexibility, some ability for people to rally around a particular event or circumstance? How do you create structures that support that? And then generate the patterns, because the thing that makes an innovator successful is consistency. Not necessarily doing the same thing over and over again, but is persistence, doing things, constantly trying new things, failing, succeeding, modifying, innovating over time. So that's really what you're doing. So when you think about what this means for innovation is stepping back. We think about the icebergs, we think about these things, of seeing what you're saying. Are you focusing on the events of what's happening here? And the pandemic is a great example of, we're looking at particular things that are happening here, but what was that based on? Why were these things allowed to fail? Why were certain things able to succeed? What were the drivers and other things that allowed us to innovate? So these are really the key things. Avoid being stuck by the now. So again, think about patterns, create a leadership moment, an opportunity for that, and the design for the point of leverage that allows you to create movement. We're almost done here. So we're just going to talk about a couple more things, a couple things like nested systems. So this is something, so any of you who've taken social science courses might know this thing. This is brought from Brenner's social ecological model. And what it is he developed this around the idea of a child. So children exist within an immediate family. So they're influenced by that family, but those families, there may be the immediate family, the secondary layer of family, maybe the community around that family. Families are embedded in communities. So what the norms and practices and institutions are within that community make a difference. Those communities exist within larger systems and over and over. So what you have is like this onion model. So when we think about what creates a healthy child, we know that the child's biology matters. We know the immediate family, their peers, their brothers and sisters, if they have any, matter. They influence the child. We know that the communities, the norms, the practices, etc., all matter to different degrees, to different situations, which is a complex phenomenon. But we know that there's this embeddedness. So when you think about this from an innovation perspective, is how do you structure these kinds of things, and where are you as an innovator in the center of this map, and what are the environments? This is where your sketching and drawing skills can really come in quite handy. All right, systems innovation and systemic design. This is just another thing. I'm just going to create a small mention here. This idea about understanding systemic design is really about this idea about understanding and designing these kinds of systems. So how does this actually work in practice? There's a number of different tools, a whole movement now on systemic design. But what these are people trying to think about, how do we change the system? So if you're thinking about educating your children, the answer isn't necessarily to focus on the child. It might not be on the family. It might not even be on the teacher. Maybe how do we understand the entire mental model for what education actually means? So that's really quite critical there. So it's really about this designing the system. Most of the time, this is done by nonprofits and governments, because when we're designing entire systems, like large social systems, what we're looking at is you have to have partnerships and collaborations. You have to have people buy in to this. So that's really where that all comes together. Lastly, I'm just going to finish off this. This is the idea of networks. Networks are another one of the types of systems that we think a lot about. These things are actually quite, not just social networks, but social networks is in technological platforms, but the social networks that we're a part of. Networks, these kind of network maps make things visible. They make things visible and they allow us to see relationships between people. So the more we can do this, the more we can start to understand some of the aphorisms that we might know about networks, like you complete me. I'm part of something, I come up with someone else. We're two parts of a coming together to create a whole. We're better together, or birds of a feather flock together, or there's strength in numbers. So the other thing that network effects might do is that they help us mediate through others and through other things. So that's actually one of the critical aspects of things. This is a map. This is actually a map that I helped create with my brilliant colleague, Tim Huerta, who's at Ohio State University. Back quite a few years ago, we were working with a community of practice. These are all nodes of individuals. So you don't need to know the specifics around this, but what it does is I want to point out a few things. So if you happen to notice, say, just take the very top of the diagram there, sort of on to the right-hand side, what you see is the 7947, and those numbers simply represent individuals, anonymized. What you have is a chain. So they are connected to this community by knowing one other person. That one other person knows one other person who happens to know is be connected to three others. As you can see, 4487 connected to 6137, and then there. So if we think about that, as I also want to mention that there's no good or bad network shape. But what it means is that if you're thinking about communicating with somebody, this might be, this person has to communicate with a second person and then all the way up to the third. So it's a more fragile network. So it's in this case is that all you lose is one of those people, and you lose all the, you lose sorry, I should say it's more fragile. It's a weaker in terms of distribution, because you have to do one person to one person. If we look at the bottom, so we go down to the bottom there, we see 6306, they're a hub. So we have the hub and spoke model. So this idea is that this person here is both very efficient, but also more fragile, because if that person decides they no longer want to be a part of this community, everything disappears. So in this case, understanding the power of these networks, these things could be institutions, they could be businesses, they could be individuals. There's a lot of different things that these things can offer. But one of the things that they do is showcase how there's relationships between these people. Now, interestingly, is that we collected data on people, and we saw how this evolved over time. People who might be highly social, highly connected, are, what their relationships were and that sort of thing. So getting a bit of a sense of that can really make a big difference. So with that, let's start a little bit of conversation, but we can actually, before we do that, I just want to promote just a couple of things. Talk a little bit about the Cense Academy. So I mentioned this idea of a Cense Academy, and really what this is a new initiative. It is meant to be a platform for innovators. This has come from a very deeply personal place, but also just something of watching what's happened, particularly over the last few years. People have been challenged. The world is changing very quickly. It's been accelerated over the last year. People are trying to understand how to innovate. They need little pieces and they're learning differently. We're learning often much more remotely. So what we do is we have an entire platform based on pieces of content that are well-timed. The idea of drops and ripples, if we want to use this water analogy. So we've got blogs, a newsletter. We also have waves. So we actually have a community that's developing webinars like this one, full on-demand courses, as well as coaching opportunities. So these things are all part of what the Cense Academy is. What I would encourage you to do is go to www.sense.academy. You can find more information there. You can sign up and register for anything that you would like, as well as being somebody who has signed up for this webinar. You also have that opportunity to join in, and you're already a part of the Academy there. So you'll be getting information and updates from us in terms of what's coming up soon, including January 6th, 2021. We've got the next webinar in the series called Understanding Impact, looking at evaluation, the feedback mechanisms, and then later on in the month, we'll have one on design thinking. Lastly, I just want to encourage you that the first wave of our full course, that's all this content plus in the other webinars and much more, is coming in January 2021. Information is available on the website. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you attending. It's great to share this, and I look forward to your comments and feedback, both in our chat now and as well as in the comments below if you're watching this after the fact. Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Cameron Norman. This is the Cense Academy, and thank you for learning systems. Good luck in understanding yours.